Well, it's good to be here. I learned a long time ago, moved to Roanoke 25, 26 years ago, and I learned that whenever George Kegley calls, you need to seriously consider whatever he's asking you to do. So it's good to be here. I told him, I said, there's only one condition to my being here. And I said, our first grandchild is due that week that you want me here. And I said, if she comes, I am not going to be at the History Museum. So, Abby was born day before yesterday. My wife and I both teach at the community college. We taught our classes. We knew they were at the hospital. We taught our classes. We packed up to head to Richmond. And about 10 feet down the driveway, we got the call that she was born. So we drove to Richmond, gave her hugs, did those the next morning, and came back, taught my class last night. So I didn't miss a beat. So we are going back this weekend and spend a little more time with them. But anyway, that was perfect timing for my school schedule and for your invitation here. That is a great lineup of things that you have going on. The Carter Fold and Cumberland Gap, and did you say the Birthplace of Country Music Museum in Bristol? Was that on your list?
We did that in May.
Oh, already done that. Okay, okay, that is great. And an interesting thing that happened after I walked in is that I realized she had to remind me that Lindsay was in my Appalachian history class quite a few years ago. I still remembered a quote from her that I have written in my textbook, and so she knows everything, if she remembers it, that I'm going to talk about probably tonight. But good to see you, Lindsay. But it is good to be here. When George asked me, I said, "What do you want me to talk about?" He said, "Something Appalachian." And I said, okay, well, the question to myself was not what do I talk about, but what do I leave out? Because there is just so much. And I tell my students at the community college that, what I teach them is about an inch deep and a mile wide, because we try to cover lots and lots of topics. It's a night class, so we're together 3 hours once a week, and, we'll do whatever it is, Native American history one night, and European settlement one night, and ecology or geography or geology one night. And so that's kind of the way that I teach it. But I don't want to overload you with too much information. I also asked George, which I always do, I said, "How long do you want me to talk?" He said, "It doesn't matter." He said, "If they start falling asleep, quit." I said, "No, I don't really work that way. I like to have sort of a time period in mind, and then what we can do is we can do some question and answer, and if you need to leave, you're certainly welcome to do that. But I don't want to overload you with information. I think we probably live in a world where that just happens to us too much already. And somebody told me once that we know more and more about less and less until pretty soon we'll know everything about nothing. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty good assessment sometimes of why do I need all this information that's coming here. But I don't want to do that tonight. But I do want to talk about some things that I really spend the first few weeks of the class that I teach at the community college. And I started this in 2006 or 7. I think I started teaching an Appalachian history class. And then when I retired from the Blue Ridge Parkway, part of the reason for deciding this was a good time was I went to my dean and said, if I was available, could I teach some other classes? And she welcomed me and kind of said, whatever you want, as much as you want, as little as you want. And I said, this sounds like a good deal. So here I am. I teach some of the United States history survey classes and continue to teach my Appalachian history class. So I'm going to go through a lot of things tonight, just share some things with you. And, if we have questions, we'll talk about that later. You know, in the Blue Ridge foothills of my childhood, everybody I can remember called it Appalachia. It was, as somebody told me once, as if I've got an apple here that I'm going to throw at you, an Appalachia. I think it was probably the media who got interested in our region and started calling it Appalachia. And I tell my classes that you can call it whatever you want to. I'm not going to ding you in the grade book for that, but that's just, you know, my perspective. There's a really interesting thing in Appalachian history, and it involves the 1960 presidential election. Of course, Kennedy and Nixon, but there was something unique about the election that year. Anybody want to guess what that might have been? It was really pretty new to Americans.
Was it Kennedy's promise to Appalachia?
Okay, that's part of it, and that's where I'm going. But generally, we watched it on television for the first time. Kennedy and Nixon debated, and there's a lot of things about how good Kennedy looked and, you know, youthful and comfortable in front of the cameras, and Nixon had too much makeup on and he was sweating bullets and all kinds of things like that. I don't know how true any of that was, but it was the first truly televised election. And we, in our living rooms, of course I'm just, you know, 7 years old or so, but we could follow candidates on the campaign trail. And John Kennedy decided and knew that he had to win West Virginia to get the White House. And so when he went into West Virginia with the TV cameras following him, and he stood on the cabins of some of the poorest people he could find, I think he even stood up in the back of a pickup truck in a coal camp somewhere, and America went, where in the world is this place that the president is campaigning? And they were seeing images of some of the poorer regions of Appalachia really for the first time. And America was enamored with the region, and they were fascinated with it. And the proof of that is that there were about a dozen or so Appalachia-themed television shows that came out over the next decade. And that's when the Beverly Hillbillies and, you know, Dukes of Hazzard is right in there, and so is Hee Haw, and so is the Waltons, and just, you know, if we think a little bit like Petticoat Junction and some of those TV shows that all had these rural themes in them, many of them from the mountains. And a lot of people point to Kennedy's movement, his campaign through Appalachia, and proof of that being all of those TV shows that cropped up. Dukes of Hazzard, if I didn't mention that, would certainly be one of them. But it was those media folks and news commentators, I think, during the campaign and also during the following war on poverty, that Lyndon Johnson followed up Kennedy's promise to the poor areas of Appalachia. And it was them, I believe, who began to change the pronunciation of what I always called Appalachia in my childhood. So I introduced the idea of an Appalachian history course to Virginia Western Community College, and I remember the day I went into the dean's office with this sort of proposal, and he kind of looked at it and he said, "What is it you want to teach?" And I said, "You know, it's a survey of Appalachian history." And he said, "Oh, really?" And I said, and I was sort of prepared. I said, "You know, you can get a," and I'm not sure what it is right now, but I said you can get a master's degree at East Tennessee State University or Appalachian State University, or maybe even at Radford in Appalachian Studies. You can get an undergraduate degree at Virginia Tech in Appalachian Studies." And he said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I know a lot of those people, and I know how it's taught, and I've had some experience and some background in it." And I said, "I think I can do a comparable job." So Jim Sargent gave me a chance, and and it's been pretty successful. I have a lot of public school teachers who take it for their extra, for the credit that they have to renew their certificates. And if nothing else, I feel like I open up their eyes to some things that they've never thought about in our region before. And that's kind of my goal, and I may do that for you tonight. So I completed graduate work about 40 years ago now in Great Smoky Mountains National Park and learned a lot. I've worked in some national park areas that had Appalachian themes in them, and spent the last 25 years on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And one of the things I did a lot of was I designed exhibits and visitor centers and publications that we gave to visitors. So if you go in some of the visitor centers on the Parkway, I've had a hand in sort of those themes and the stories that are being told there. So I began my classes, though, just with kind of 5 overarching principles. Lindsay probably remembers all of these, I'm sure. 5 overarching principles that guide us all the way through the class. It's a semester of topical discussions. I mean, we do music, we do folklore, we do geography, ecology, literature, Native Americans, European influences. And, on day 1, I tell them, Appalachia is more than just a collection of quaint stuff. And I'll tell you what, to the world, if you put a log cabin anywhere and you put a spinning wheel and a couple of quilts and a banjo player in it, they're going to walk in and say, oh, this looks like Appalachia. That's what it is. And I just want to tell them it is so much more than just that collection of quaint stuff. I tell them it's a complex region with a complex subject. I mean, all you have to do is look at the mining, the extraction of minerals in Appalachia from, iron and coal and timber and gold at one point, and all of those things to see the complexities and the struggles for the region that have taken place over history. I tell them in many ways it's just like other parts of rural America. A lot of things that we think of as iconically Appalachian really are just rural things. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate those things. People in Kansas make quilts, okay? But we think of quilts as being, ooh, that's Appalachian, that's mountain. And so I start the class with these things. I say it's a changing region, and it's always been changing. And finally, and hopefully with the most passion, I tell them Appalachia has a sense of place that residents here cling to maybe more than other parts of the country, although we can discuss that too. If you have generations that grew up farming land in the Midwest, maybe you're tied to that soil as well. And we have those discussions in class. A great deal of what I do is help students get to the core of how and why people see our region the way they do, if you call Roanoke part of Appalachia, and not everybody does. And that's worth discussing. When the Appalachian Regional Commission was established in 1965, Roanoke said, we don't want any part of that. We don't want to be linked with the people in way southwest Virginia or the coal fields or whatever, and they just didn't want to be associated with. And that's kind of an interesting thing, that although we think of ourselves as being right here in the heart of Appalachia. Why the black and white analysis of our region? I mean, ever since people started paying attention to Appalachia, they kind of walk in and say, okay, there are 4 or 5 things you need to know, and that's it. And that's what Appalachia's like. The people eat this, they look this way, they talk this way, this is their jobs, and that's pretty much all there is to it. And I say, no. It's much more complex, and there are all kinds of shades of gray or colors of the palette. And we still struggle with these things. Why is there a toothless, barefooted, banjo-playing boy with a jug and a hound dog in tile where you walk in to the Roanoke City Market. Look for it when you're down there. One of the 4 entrances that have those beautiful tile entrances has a toothless, banjo-playing, barefooted, I think he's got a dog and a jug of moonshine there, boy. And I just walk in, I go, why do we put that image here in Roanoke? And so, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we discuss. I had a discussion with someone in the city about that. I said, tell me the discussion that went on why this image, you know, is what Roanoke wants here. So anyway, that's just the kind of stereotypes that we still sort of struggle with. How has the region been portrayed in movies dating all the way back to the 1930s? And we look at some of those in class, and we look at those images and maybe how they have changed on the big screen, you know, over the years, or in comic strips. You know, Little Abner and Snuffy Smith have been around since the 1920s or 30s, and they've got all the stereotypes of Appalachian, you know, hillbillies right there in the comic strips every day. And so we talk about this, and I try to dispel some of those ideas, again, with the talking about the complexities of our culture and the changes that have taken place, and the appropriate place to put those quaint things that are part of our mountain heritage. I'm not saying do away with banjos. I play a banjo, and I love it, but it's not, you know, we just need to know the appropriate place to put those things and say that our region and our culture is so much broader than that. You know, we talk about some of those iconic images like a log cabin, sort of a historic relic, an oddity like a flintlock rifle and a powder horn or a spinning wheel, but it's certainly part of Appalachia. I don't know if you know this or not, but when the designers of the Blue Ridge Parkway went down the mountains to say, what do we keep and what do we get rid of, they almost invariably kept log cabins and got rid of all of the 2-story white framed painted houses and said, no, that's not what we want. We want the images of the pioneer living in the log cabin. And they purposely put those things in place to create an image that in some places was like that, but in other places had other kinds of residences as well. We talk about music, you know, practically inseparable from the people who have called this place home. For as long as Europeans have settled in the southern highlands, they've enjoyed that music, that so much part of their heritage. Sometimes you can hear it played identically to the German or Scottish or English versions, surroundings where the tunes originated. In other areas, it's uniquely American. And some people say the original ensemble of American music was the Europeans bringing violins or fiddles to this country, and the enslaved Africans bringing banjos. And when those met on the colonial frontier, that became, you know, the first American music, along with the German traditions of singing that, you know, influenced what happened in the Shenandoah Valley. I like to challenge my students with things like showing them a picture of a vacation home in the mountains, that something like the Moses Cone house in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, and they'll talk about it, and I'll say, this house is older than was built before Mabry Mill. And they kind of go, whoa, that challenges my thought process to think that people were building big, beautiful vacation homes while other people were building log cabins and mills with, you know, old siding on them. So it challenges their impressions of the culture. We talk about natural history, the wonderful resources that Appalachian residents, European settlers found in the mountains, especially in the American chestnut tree. You know, that tree that provided such a rich nut crop and fast-growing, straight-grained. Some people said from the blossoms came the best honey that you could find, and the mountain people just depended on that. I can share personal stories about that perfect spring morning that I still remember catching my first native brook trout in an Appalachian stream, and learning, as someone said, you fish here, you never see a mountain stream without thinking about trout again the rest of your life. And at some point you realize that that little beautifully colored fish that we have in our mountain streams is more than just a fish. It is an indicator of the health of the entire ecosystem around you. And that's just an important concept. And so all of these things are things I try to do early in the semester and builds kind of a foundation to get them thinking sort of outside the box and outside of the preconceived notions. And as we start dealing with all those topics along the way. So how did America learn about Appalachia? The people and the resources of the mountains, and what was their response, and how much of that still lingers today. That's an important piece of the puzzle of Appalachian history. And I'll give you the short version, but it goes something like this. In the realm of literature, there is something back in history called regionalism or local color history. There was a time period after the American Civil War when there were magazines were becoming a more common part of American homes. Sort of middle class people could afford them. There were Scribner's, Appleton's, Leslie's Illustrated. There are a whole bunch of those. And the writers were looking for these interesting little pockets of places to write about that people now call local color fiction. And it included stories of the characters and the dialect and the customs and the history of a particular region. And a lot of times they were very sentimental, very nostalgic. And they happened all over the country. And it was very popular in the years following the Civil War. New and strong ideas. We had survived Civil War. America was on the move. Industrialization was there, and Americans felt very proud, and they were moving in the right direction. And industrialization on the rise. Well, in the midst of this, in the summer of 1869, a Boston physician named Will Wallace Harney traveled in the Cumberland Mountains of Kentucky looking for a topic for local color in one of these magazines, and he wrote about his journey in Lippincott's magazine, and he called the article that he wrote "A Strange Land and a Peculiar People." Need we say anything more? Will Harney had gone off in the mountains of Kentucky, and he'd found people living there that basically, most Americans didn't even know anybody lived up in the mountains. So Harney wrote really unusual things. He talked about the geological, the botanical curiosities, about the unfamiliar customs among an unfamiliar people. He said the natives of this region are characterized by marked peculiarities of their anatomy. He talked about their long limbs and their long legs and their long arms, and the relative, he even said that their harsh features exemplified the late President Lincoln, he said. And if Will Harney was the only one who had done this, it wouldn't be a very big deal. In a sense, he kind of introduced America to Appalachia. But, and just listen to these numbers, between 1870 and 1890, we have record of 125 short stories in these magazines with Appalachia as the subject of the theme, 90 sketches. Between 1875 and 1900, 46 novels were written with Appalachia as the theme. I mean, America was inundated in the late 19th century with these stories, many of them very stereotyped, very black and white, trying to write the dialect that they heard from people in the mountains. And Henry Shapiro, in a book called Appalachia on Our Minds, says that the cumulative effect of these publications, which took Appalachia as a subject, was the establishment of a conventional view of the mountain region as an area that had been untouched by the progress and the unifying forces that seemed to be at work everywhere else in the United States. And Americans sort of had this inundated with these stories and these novels, and some of them were extremely popular reads, extremely popular novels. And people thought, there is a place in America, somewhere down in the southern mountains, where, you know, it's like another culture. And these people are being left behind from all the progress that the rest of America is sort of making. Appalachia was becoming, in the minds of the readers of these stories, a very separate and distinct kind of part of America. And it was a very short jump to the conclusion that this strange land, with its peculiar people, that Will Harney had written about, was actually the opposite of the rest of America. And after that time, so America had to sort of deal with this. What are we going to do, or should we do anything about this culture that they were reading about? And travelers and writers and geographers and teachers and industrialists, all kinds of groups of people approached this region from this point of view. A sense of wonder prevailed, some people say, about the Appalachian Mountains. And missionaries were also interested. Practically every Protestant church in America saw Appalachia as a mission field. If you've ever seen the TV movie of Christy, that's a very true, very real. She heard a missionary speak in her church in Asheville and said, I'm looking for people to come to the deep, dark mountain communities of East Tennessee and for schools and to uplift the mountain people. And Christy said, that's where I want to go and where I want to teach. And so this was part of the result of America finding out about Appalachia. The dominant theme sort of became, we, the rest of America, are like this, but they, up in the mountains, are different. And they're something else. And in America, there were kind of two trends of thought that came. And I'll just list them. I'm not trying to describe people, but a lot of folks said, are these backward, ignorant, unchurched, unhealthy, violent, morally regenerate social misfits? Or are they, on the other hand, pure, uncorrupted, 100% Americans, and the rest of us have forgotten what it's like to be a first or second generation American? And so you had sort of these two camps of people. And if you were somebody like Christy, you may have gone in the mountains saying, there is a problem that I think I can help fix. I can educate, I can uplift, I can teach these poor underprivileged mountain children. On the other hand, you might have said, I'm going up there and I'm going to record the English ballads that they're still singing, that their ancestors brought over. I'm going to learn the crafts and the folklore that they have in their culture that maybe the rest of us need to be aware of. So there was this two trains of thought. Are they a great untapped national treasure, or are they a national liability, a problem to be fixed? And when you read about the history of Appalachia, you sort of have to figure out, okay, which perspective does this author have? And there were huge, great things of folklorists who traveled in the mountains and recorded the music and recorded stories and learned about the folkways and some of the things that were going on in the mountains. And so all of this began to enter into the American mindset. And some of those novels, one in particular, John Fox Jr.'s Trail of the Lonesome Pine, that they still show as an outdoor drama down in Big Stone Gap. That was the most popular American novel ever written before what? Gone with the Wind, exactly. I mean, people just ate up that story, and that had a lot of those stereotypes of the language, the customs, the culture. But John Fox Jr. fits into that part of the story. And it wasn't just reserved to, there are a few examples of pretty famous people who had a little bit of this same idea as well. This is much earlier, but when Thomas Jefferson, on one of his trips from Monticello to his second home, Poplar Forest over near Lynchburg, he used to go through the mountains. He would go by Natural Bridge, which he owned the land there at one time. And he would very often take his granddaughters with him. And there is a copy of a letter that one of his granddaughters wrote to her cousin, I think it was, and she describes going through the mountains around Natural Bridge, and she says, "We were among that half-civilized race from beyond the mountains." These are the Jeffersons talking, okay? These are not uneducated people. Among them were the most savage-looking men, uncivilized in manner and appearance. And if you go on and read her letter, you find out that she says they had no shirts, they were barefooted, there were children running around the cabins, he had a gun over his shoulder, all the stereotypes that we might have. But, I mean, that's what she said that she saw. But I find that fascinating to read that and think, this is Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, that's, has this perception of all of the people in the mountains. So Appalachia has sometimes been defined as someone calls it a folklorist natural habitat. The region was at the forefront of the development of all kinds of fields of American folklore throughout the 20th century. And right after the turn of the 20th century, this is kind of interesting, the Kentucky Folklore Society was founded in 1912. The Virginia Folklore Society was founded in 1913. The North Carolina Folklore Society was founded in 1913. The West Virginia Folklore Society was founded in 1913. All of these states in the heart of Appalachia were beginning to say, we've got an issue, and for them, folklorists, it was we've got to preserve and protect this culture that is part of America's past that is slowly slipping away. The first folk festival in the United States was in Asheville in the early 1920s. The Bristol sessions, the recording that Victor Records did down in Bristol, that with Ralph Peer, right, that launched the career of the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers and others, was in 1927. And you see, this was a time period that people in the North were saying, wow, there is something down there we've got to catch. And so they were running down to the southern mountains, setting up studios, and just putting it in the newspaper and saying, anybody that wants to record, come in here and let us listen to you. That's when the White Top Folk Festival down in Southwest Virginia was popular in the early 1930s. So popular that Eleanor Roosevelt went one year because she had this personal interest in preserving the heritage of the Appalachian region. She was there, I think it was in 33. The festival lasted 6 or 7 years or something like that. But she took a train down to Abingdon, got on a car, and they drove her up to the top of White Top Mountain where the festival was taking place. So these ingrained stereotypes of the whole period are many times what visitors to places like the Blue Ridge Parkway come in, even today, expecting to see. And we struggle with that a little bit and how to do the correct interpretation on the parkway. Shenandoah National Park, Great Smoky Mountains, and Blue Ridge Parkway were all kind of being done at the same time, and all of them have some of that attempt of interpreting the life of the people who lived in the mountains. A lot of information here, and you know, some of it sort of pains us to think, why do people think so badly of folks, in this part of the country, in our beautiful mountains? But there is a bright side to this, and I think more and more people are beginning to embrace, diverse cultures, things they've never seen before, and they're certainly doing that in parts of our Blue Ridge and our Appalachians as well. I think one of the best captures of that is in a little part of an article that I want to read to you to sort of wrap this up. There are a lot of great Appalachian authors out there, and to be quite honest with you, there are several who've come out of Hollins University, here in Roanoke, and Lee Smith is one of those. And Lee Smith is, one of the most noted Appalachian authors, has been, over the decades. Wrote her first novel when she was a student at Hollins. But she had an article a number of years ago in an Appalachian journal called Raised to Leave. And I have edited it down, so she's not here, is she? Apologies to Lee Smith. If you want to find this on the internet, you can find it and read the entire thing. But I think she captures a lot about what people have thought and what they are beginning to think about Appalachia. So let me just read a little bit of this to you. She says, "I was born in a rugged ring of mountains in Southwest Virginia, mountains so high, so straight up and down that the sun didn't even hit our yard till about 11 o'clock in the morning. We never thought of our jagged mountains as scenic, though we played in them every day after school, making forts and clubhouses and swinging on grapevines until they rang the bell to call us home for supper. We never saw a tourist, and nobody we knew hiked for fun. We were closed in entirely, cut off from the outside world by our ring of mountains. Many of the children that I went to school with had never been out of Buchanan County. My own mother was referred to as a foreigner at her funeral, though it had been 50 years since she'd come here to teach home economics and married my daddy. She'd spent all those years trying to civilize him and his whole unruly clan, but it was a challenge. So I was being raised to leave. I was not to use double negatives. I was not to say me and Martha. I was not to trade my pimento cheese sandwiches at school for what I really wanted, cornbread and buttermilk in a mason jar brought by the kids from back in the hollers. Me and Martha were not to play in the Black River behind our house, dirty with the coal that they were washing upstream. I was to play Clair de Lune at my piano recital. I was not to like mountain music that surrounded us on every side, from the men playing banjo and mandolins on the sidewalk outside my daddy's dime store on Saturdays. But here, my mother ran into serious trouble because I loved that music. Even my mother enjoyed going to the drive-in theater on Saturday evenings in the summer to hear Ralph and Carter Stanley, two brothers from over in Dickinson County, play and sing their bluegrass music on top of the square concrete concession stand. I never will marry, I'll take me no wife, I intend to live single all of my life. That's what Ralph would wail mournfully, followed by a fast instrumental version of Shout Little Lulu. Old people clogging on the patch of concrete in front of the window where you bought your Cokes and popcorn, and little kids were swinging on iron pipe swing sets, whole families on quilts on the grass eating fried chicken. Stanley Brothers' nasal voices rose higher than the gathering mist. And when it got full dark, the Stanley Brothers climbed down off the concession stand. We all got in our cars and the movie came on. But this hillbilly music didn't have anything to do with culture, which I was constantly being reminded of. No, culture was someplace else. And when the time came, I would be sent off to get some. Culture was in big cities like Richmond and Washington and Paris and Boston and London and New York, especially New York, and especially in places like Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall, where on June the 9th, 2001, I stood on my $100 balcony seat and screamed as 74-year-old Dr. Ralph Stanley and the rest of the traditional musicians and singers on the Old Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack played to a sold-out house. That CD, phenomenally successful, both this country and abroad. And that night belonged to Ralph Stanley. He came out last all by himself. He took center stage to give his famous a cappella rendition of the terrifying "Oh Death," with all the lights black except for a single spotlight trained directly on him. "Oh Death, won't you spare me over for another year?" His high, haunting voice filled that huge, dark hall. And the song lasted for 5 minutes, followed by almost a full minute of total silence. And then pandemonium broke out. The stage lights went up, the house lights went on, all the other performers rushed out on stage, and the standing ovation went on and on. And it seemed to me that Dr. Ralph Stanley's Carnegie Hall appearance symbolizes something that's happening to Appalachian culture as a whole. Now, everybody in the region realizes that we don't have to go any other place to get culture. Every little town in the mountains has its own festival, celebrating itself with local foods and crafts and music, whether it's called a Blackberry Festival or a Ramp Festival or a Woolly Worm Contest or a Gingerbread Day or a Fiddler's Convention, fueled by a nationally politically correct appreciation of whatever still ethnically or geographically or culturally distinct. America as a whole is coming to appreciate its values and value its differences. Everybody understands that our own Appalachian culture is as rich and diverse in terms of history and arts and crafts and literature and folklore and music as any other area in the country. I personally sometimes wish that I could be back in the simpler, saner, safer world of my childhood, eating a piece of fried chicken on a quilt at the drive-in theater while Ralph Stanley played music on top of the concession stand. I know I can't go back there. The drive-in's long gone, and so am I. But I'll tell you something else. I was mighty proud to be there the night Dr. Ralph played at Carnegie Hall. I think that says a lot about our region. So, Appalachia, more than just a collection of quaint stuff. Rich, rich history. A complex region, a complex subject. In many ways, not every way, but some ways, just like other parts of rural America. Changing and always been that way, and finally, a sense of place. And that's what I try to convey to my students and hopefully have done tonight. But so pronounce it any way you want to, but to me, it'll always be home, it'll always be Appalachia, as it was in my childhood. Thank you for calling me here tonight. Different questions and answers? Sure. I don't know what everybody's schedule is. Yes, sir.
In a book I'm reading now about the United States of Appalachia, it says that there's some folks from Appalachia who have made important contributions to humanity.
I'm sure there are. I'm familiar with that book. Go ahead.
One of them mentioned was Pearl Buck.
Pearl Buck, exactly. Yeah, there are many great authors from our region. I went to an Appalachian Studies conference. I used to go to these pretty often a few years ago. And if you go to most conferences, there's a room about the size of this, and all the publishing houses have their wares. You know, they have tables. And there were 33 tables of publishing companies selling material on Appalachian Studies. And I just went, wow, from the University of Illinois all the way down to, East Tennessee State or University of Tennessee. So it's a great, great topic. All kinds of wonderful novels that are now being written about Appalachia. Other questions? Anything? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the chestnut trees. How's the research coming on trying to provide them?
Well, they're making progress. I don't know exactly what step they're at, but they keep crossbreeding chestnut with the Chinese chestnut and trying to get as pure a strain as they can that will still be resistant to the blight. I would love to think that I would get to see chestnuts again. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but they do grow fast. I mean, the people that remember and say you could plant the nuts and in 20 years have a great crop of trees. But some parts of the Appalachians, they claim that there were 50% chestnuts. And it's just hard to imagine that there aren't any nut bearing anymore. They still come from the roots, but they don't get old enough. Yes, ma'am.
I went to the movies at the Grandin this week and saw A Walk in the Woods, and they mispronounced the word Appalachia.
I heard that.
And I also put McAfee Knob in the Shenandoah National Park.
Okay, well, yeah, people will.
Appalachian Trail. Good reviews. It's on the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
They
Yeah.
qualify.
People will do that. There are actually several really good novels that are coming to the big screen. Ron Rash's Serena, I think, is out now. I don't know if anybody's seen it or not. It's about the lumber barons in Great Smoky Mountains National Park that were trying to get as much timber as they could before the national park came. You didn't like it? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. And I haven't seen it. Wish You Well, which is a David Baldacci novel, is, I think, coming to the big screen. It's the only thing Appalachian-based that I guess he's ever done. Adriana Trigiani's Big Stone Gap has recently come out in some format. It's not like in the theaters, but it's a movie. Maybe it's foreign production or something. So
There's a new book called Big Stone Gap, written by a lady whose name I don't know, but anyway,
Right.
she wanted to come. She was not from this area at all, and she got interested in Appalachia and wrote a book on a bookstore in Appalachia, in Big Stone Gap.
okay. Well,
That's
the
been out a
novel,
while.
I'm thinking of by Adriana Trigiani she is from Big Stone Gap, and she wrote a whole series of Appalachian novels. But Big Stone Gap, she really held out until she could find a company that would do it on location instead of going to Hollywood to do it. But I haven't seen any. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Just an observation. There was a movie in the late 30s, I think, with Gary Cooper, Sergeant York,
Right.
which was a great, introduction to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and he was from East Tennessee. And so that, I don't remember, I've seen that, I don't remember how much, Appalachian heritage is sort of displayed. The two older movies that I use in my class are Trail of the Lonesome Pine, based on the John Fox Jr. book, and the other is called Shepherd of the Hills. And Trail of the Lonesome Pine has Fred McMurray and as about a 20-year-old, and Spanky McFarland, who was one of the Little Rascals, as a little mountain boy. But it was the first movie Hollywood ever did in what they call Technicolor. I mean, it was one of those blockbusters, the same year as, I think, King Kong and Gone with the Wind and, Wizard of Oz, maybe right in that era.
39.
It was a big deal. So we show parts of that in class, and it's kind of fun to watch. A lot of them were from New England. Many of them were seminary trained, and they had this social philosophy of their faith, that it was their object in life to lift up and teach and train impoverished people, and they just looked upon Appalachia as one of those areas. And some of those schools are still in existence. They've changed their focus, but the Hindman Settlement School over in Eastern Kentucky is one of those. The John C. Campbell Folk School down in Western North Carolina. And I'm pretty sure that Berea College comes out of that same background, with that same sort of motivation of doing something to help and assist and lift up the poverty-stricken mountain people. And sometimes part of the deal was trying to get them to market their crafts. And so people would come to these schools and they would, learn how to take the chairs they had made and market them in northeastern cities and things like that. But really big deal, 1920s era. But religion did have a part in that. Yes. George.
What about Foxfire?
Yeah, there is a movie called Foxfire. You're thinking of the Raven Gap studies, yeah, and the Foxfire books. What is it up to? 10 or 12 volumes, probably now, or something like that. Started in the late 1960s, and there was a revival folklore movement in the 1960s in America. And a lot of that came from what was going on at Raven Gap was part of that. There were some really interesting. The first bluegrass festival in the country, 1965, up here in Fincastle. They still call that sort of the first outdoor bluegrass festival, mountain music sort of festival. And of course, we've got the Fiddlers Conventions that have been going on since the 20s and 30s, in this region. But the 1960s, the folk movement was significant in preserving a lot of Appalachia. I have a little personal story that I tell my class, and this is still fascinating to me. I grew up in the Blue Ridge foothills in North Carolina, and there was a guy in our little hometown that built houses, Garley Foster. Garley built the house that I grew up in. He was one of these sort of one-man carpenters that could, do it all. And Garley came in our backyard one day in the late 1960s, and he had an album under his arm. And he wanted to give it to my dad, and he had autographed it. And Daddy sort of thought, well, thank you, but what is this? And Garley said, well, I said, back when I was young, I used to play some music, and, we were, we traveled up and down the eastern seaboard, made music, and some guy from New York came down and, found us, 2 or 3 of us that were still living and wanted to record some of our music. And, I didn't realize it then. Now I know that was that whole 1960s folk revival, people coming into the mountains looking for these old timers. That's the way Doc Watson was sort of rediscovered after some of the things that he did earlier in his life. But Garley was part of that, and what was going on at Rapin Gap High School with preserving the culture was roughly that same time period. Other questions? Folks, thank you again for inviting me.